Imagine being entrusted with protecting one of the most valuable cattle bloodlines on Earth. Not gold, not weapons, not classified government secrets, but a small herd of rare cattle whose ancestry stretched back centuries. Now imagine a world war threatening to erase that bloodline forever. As World War II engulfed Europe and German bombers targeted British cities, fears grew that invasion, destruction, or wartime hardship could wipe out countless pieces of Britain's heritage. Among the treasures considered at risk was an extraordinary herd of ancient white cattle, animals so rare and unique that many believed they represented a living connection to Europe's distant past. Faced with the possibility that these remarkable creatures could disappear forever, British conservationists and livestock experts made an extraordinary decision. A select group of the cattle would be transported across the Atlantic Ocean to safety, undertaking a perilous wartime journey through waters patrolled by German submarines. Their destination was not Canada, Australia, or another territory of the British Empire. Instead, they were sent to Texas, where they would serve as a safeguard against extinction. This is the remarkable story of how Britain rescued a sacred herd during World War II, preserving a priceless legacy through one of the most unusual wartime evacuation missions ever attempted. To understand why Britain would eventually undertake one of the most unusual animal rescue missions of the Second World War, we must begin centuries before the conflict itself, in the windswept countryside of northern England. Near the border with Scotland lies Chillingham Park, an ancient estate whose history stretches deep into the medieval past. For generations, visitors arriving at this secluded landscape encountered a sight unlike anything else in Britain. Grazing across the parkland was a herd of remarkable white cattle whose appearance seemed almost legendary. Their coats were strikingly pale, their ears marked with distinctive colors, and their long horns curved outward in a way that gave them a powerful and ancient presence. Yet it was not merely their appearance that made them extraordinary. These animals behaved differently from ordinary farm cattle. They were wary of humans, highly protective of their social groups, and far more independent than the livestock commonly seen elsewhere in the country. Unlike cattle raised on modern farms, they lived with minimal human interference, roaming the enclosed park much as their ancestors had done for centuries. To many observers, they appeared less like domesticated animals and more like survivors from another age. Their existence inspired fascination among travelers, historians, and naturalists, who often describe them as living relics preserved by time itself. The herd became known as the Chillingham cattle, and over the centuries they earned a reputation as one of Britain's most remarkable natural treasures. The origins of the Chillingham cattle have long been surrounded by mystery. Historical records suggest that the herd may have been isolated within the estate since the Middle Ages, although the exact date remains uncertain. What is clear is that for hundreds of years, these animals lived apart from other cattle populations. Generation after generation bred only among themselves, creating a level of isolation almost unheard of in livestock. While most cattle breeds were continually shaped by trade, selective breeding, and the movement of animals between regions, the Chillingham herd remained enclosed within the same boundaries. This unusual history transformed them into one of the most distinctive cattle populations in the world. As scientific understanding advanced during the 19th and early 20th centuries, researchers became increasingly intrigued by what this isolation might reveal. Some believed the cattle preserved physical and behavioral characteristics that had largely disappeared from other breeds. Others argued that they represented a rare window into the livestock of medieval Europe.
The debate over their origins would continue for decades, but the herd's uniqueness was undeniable.
Scientists, historians, and conservationists all recognized that these animals occupied a special place in Britain's heritage. They were more than livestock.
They were living artifacts, carrying within them centuries of biological history that could not easily be replaced.
Every generation that survived added another chapter to a story that stretched back far beyond the modern age, making the herd an increasingly valuable link between the present and the distant past. By the early 20th century, the Chillingham cattle had become internationally known among specialists interested in rare breeds and natural history.
Visitors traveled considerable distances to observe them, and scientific studies sought to understand their genetics, social behavior, and long-term survival.
Yet, beneath the admiration lay a growing concern. The very isolation that made the herd so unique also made it vulnerable. Their numbers were small, and every animal belonged to a single population living in a single location. There was no second herd elsewhere in Britain, and no reserve population overseas. If disease, environmental disaster, or human conflict struck Chillingham Park, the consequences could be catastrophic.
The realization troubled many observers who understood how easily unique populations could disappear.
Throughout history, countless species and breeds had vanished forever because they lacked the protection of multiple populations.
The Chillingham cattle seemed especially vulnerable because so much depended on the continued safety of one estate in northern England. At a time when the world around them was changing rapidly, the future of the remarkable white cattle appeared far less secure than many people realized. Their survival had endured through centuries of political upheaval, economic transformation, and agricultural change, but new challenges were emerging that threatened not only the herd itself, but the stability of Europe as a whole. As the 20th century progressed, concern for the future of the Chillingham cattle became increasingly tied to broader developments in science and conservation.
Researchers studying the herd recognized that it represented something extraordinarily rare. While commercial livestock breeding focused on productivity and efficiency, the value of the Chillingham cattle lay in their uniqueness. Their long isolation had created a population unlike any other. Scientists viewed them as an opportunity to study the effects of centuries of limited genetic exchange, while historians saw them as living survivors from an earlier era of British agriculture. The herd's unusual social behavior also attracted attention. They maintained complex hierarchies, defended territories within the park, and displayed instincts more commonly associated with wild animals than domestic cattle. Observers frequently remarked on how different they seemed from ordinary farm livestock. These characteristics reinforced the belief that the herd represented an important biological and historical resource. By preserving the cattle, Britain was preserving more than a rare breed. It was safeguarding a living connection to its own past. Such ideas were becoming increasingly influential during a period when awareness of conservation was beginning to expand. People were starting to understand that heritage could take many forms. Historic buildings, ancient manuscripts, archaeological sites, and rare animal populations all carried pieces of history that deserved protection. The Chillingham cattle stood at the intersection of these concerns, embodying both natural and cultural significance in a way few other animals could. Despite this growing appreciation, the herd remained vulnerable. Conservation experts understood a simple but important principle. Any population confined to a single location faces significant risks. A severe disease outbreak could devastate the herd.
Harsh environmental conditions could reduce already limited numbers. Human activity could alter the habitat upon which the cattle depended. Because every member of the population lived within the same estate, any major disaster would threaten the entire bloodline at once. These concerns became more urgent during the 1930s as international tensions intensified. Across Europe, political instability was growing. Aggressive governments expanded their influence, military forces increased in strength, and the prospect of another major war became increasingly difficult to ignore. Newspapers carried reports of invasions, diplomatic crises, and mounting confrontation between nations. For most people, these events raised concerns about national security and the possibility of conflict. For those responsible for protecting rare and irreplaceable resources, they raised additional questions. What would happen to Britain's unique heritage if war reached the country itself? Could valuable collections, historic sites, and rare animal populations survive the destruction that modern warfare might bring? The Chillingham cattle, confined to a single location and already limited in number, became an obvious cause for concern. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 transformed theoretical concerns into immediate realities. Britain suddenly found itself engaged in a struggle that would reshape the world. As German forces advanced across Europe, uncertainty spread throughout the country. The fall of nation after nation demonstrated how quickly established assumptions could collapse. By 1940, following the defeat of France, the threat of invasion seemed frighteningly real. British officials prepared for scenarios that only a few years earlier would have appeared unimaginable. Plans were developed to protect vital industries, cultural treasures, government records, and scientific resources. But across the nation, people began considering what could be saved if the worst occurred. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the situation of the Chillingham cattle attracted renewed attention. Their importance had long been recognized, but wartime conditions highlighted their vulnerability more clearly than ever before. The entire bloodline depended on a single herd occupying a single location. If that herd disappeared, centuries of history would vanish with it. There would be no replacement and no opportunity to rebuild what had been lost. The prospect of extinction was not merely a scientific concern. It represented the possible destruction of a unique part of Britain's heritage. The growing fear that war could erase something so irreplaceable would ultimately inspire extraordinary efforts to protect the herd, setting in motion a remarkable chain of events that would carry these ancient white cattle far beyond the fields of northern England and across the Atlantic Ocean toward an unexpected refuge in Texas. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, entering a conflict that would soon grow into the largest and most destructive war in human history. At first, many people believed the fighting might remain limited to parts of Europe, much as previous conflicts had done. Few could imagine the scale of destruction that lay ahead. As the months passed, however, it became increasingly clear that this would not be a short or localized war. German military forces unleashed a series of campaigns that stunned governments and military leaders across the continent. Employing fast-moving tactics that combined armored divisions, aircraft, and coordinated ground assaults, the German army achieved victory after victory. Poland was defeated within weeks, demonstrating the effectiveness of a new style of warfare that many nations were unprepared to counter. Soon afterward, Denmark and Norway fell under German control, extending Nazi influence across Northern Europe and threatening important strategic routes. Yet, these early victories were only the beginning. In the spring of 1940, Germany launched a massive offensive against Western Europe.
Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, collectively known as the Low Countries, were rapidly overwhelmed. Their defenses collapsed far more quickly than many military experts had predicted. The speed of these conquests shocked observers around the world and shattered confidence in the security of Europe's established order.
For Britain, the situation became even more alarming as German forces turned their attention toward France. Long regarded as one of Europe's most powerful military nations, France was expected to provide a strong barrier against further German expansion. Instead, German armies advanced with astonishing speed, bypassing defensive positions and driving deep into French territory. Within weeks, the French military found itself in crisis. The collapse that followed was one of the most dramatic events of the war's early years. By June 1940, France had surrendered, leaving Britain in a position that would have seemed almost unimaginable only months earlier. Nearly all of Western Europe now lay under German occupation or influence. The strategic balance had shifted dramatically, and Britain found itself standing largely alone against a seemingly unstoppable enemy. Across the country, newspapers carried reports of military defeats, occupied capitals, and advancing German armies. For ordinary citizens, the future appeared uncertain and increasingly dangerous. Political leaders, military commanders, and government planners faced a difficult reality. The war was no longer a distant conflict taking place elsewhere. It was becoming a direct threat to Britain's survival. The victories that Germany had achieved in such a short period created a growing sense that almost anything was possible. If entire nations could be conquered in weeks, then even Britain, protected by the English Channel, could no longer assume its safety was guaranteed. The nation entered one of the most anxious periods in its modern history, as preparations began for dangers that many hoped would never materialize, but could no longer be ignored. The sense of crisis deepened dramatically during the events surrounding Dunkirk in the spring of 1940. As German forces swept through France and the Low Countries, the British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, found itself trapped near the northern coast of France. Surrounded by advancing enemy forces and facing the possibility of complete destruction, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were cut off from escape by land. The situation appeared catastrophic. If Britain's trained army were captured or annihilated, the country's ability to defend itself against future attack would be severely weakened. In response, an extraordinary evacuation effort was organized. Military vessels, merchant ships, fishing boats, pleasure craft, and countless civilian vessels crossed the English Channel to rescue the stranded troops. Over several days, more than 300,000 soldiers were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk in what became one of the most famous operations of the war. The evacuation was celebrated as a remarkable achievement, but beneath the relief lay a sobering reality. The soldiers had escaped, but enormous quantities of equipment had been abandoned. Tanks, artillery pieces, vehicles, weapons, and supplies were left behind. Britain had saved much of its army, yet it remained vulnerable. Following the fall of France, the possibility of a German invasion became a central concern. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler and his military commanders considered plans for an assault on Britain. German aircraft intensified attacks against British targets, while preparations for a potential invasion generated widespread anxiety. Government officials recognized that they had to prepare for the worst. Emergency planning expanded rapidly. Coastal defenses were strengthened. Military units were reorganized and reinforced. Civil defense programs encouraged citizens to prepare for air raids and other emergencies. Yet the preparations extended far beyond military matters. The government also considered how to preserve Britain's institutions, cultural heritage, and essential resources in the event of prolonged conflict. Factories critical to wartime production dispersed operations across multiple locations to reduce the risk of destruction from bombing. Valuable works of art and historical treasures were relocated to safer areas. Important government records were stored securely to ensure continuity if offices were damaged or destroyed. Millions of children were evacuated from cities vulnerable to air attack and sent to rural communities where they would be safer. Every aspect of national life was examined through the lens of survival. The goal was not simply to win the war, but to preserve the nation and everything that made it unique. Across Britain, people understood that certain things could not easily be replaced once lost. Buildings could sometimes be rebuilt, industries could recover, and records could be recreated, but some losses would be permanent. This realization encouraged planners and experts in many different fields to think carefully about what needed protection before circumstances became even more dangerous. The fear of invasion, bombing, and disruption influenced decisions across the country, reaching far beyond the military sphere and into areas that few people might have associated with wartime planning. Among those deeply concerned about the future were the scientists, conservationists, landowners, and agricultural experts responsible for protecting Britain's rare animal populations. While headlines focused on battles, air raids, and military strategy, these individuals worried about a different kind of casualty. They understood that war could threaten not only human lives and national infrastructure, but also unique biological lineages that had survived for centuries. Many rare breeds existed in small numbers and depended upon fragile circumstances for their continued survival. Wartime disruption could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. Disease outbreaks, shortages of food and resources, changes in land use, military occupation, or direct destruction from bombing could all place vulnerable populations at risk. Once a rare breed disappeared, it could not be recreated. The loss would be permanent. Few examples illustrated this danger more clearly than the Chillingham cattle. For centuries, these remarkable white cattle had survived in isolation within Chillingham Park in northern England. Their unusual history and genetic uniqueness made them one of the most distinctive cattle populations in the world. Scientists valued them as a rare biological resource. Historians regarded them as living connections to Britain's past. Conservationists saw them as an irreplaceable part of the nation's natural heritage. Yet their survival depended upon a remarkably fragile arrangement. Unlike commercial livestock breeds distributed across countless farms, the Chillingham cattle existed as a single herd in a single location. Every member of the population lived within the same estate. There was no second herd elsewhere in Britain, and no overseas population preserving the bloodline. The consequences of this situation became increasingly troubling as the war intensified. A disease outbreak affecting the herd could eliminate a significant portion of the population. Bombing raids, though perhaps unlikely in such a rural area, could still damage the landscape and facilities necessary for the cattle's survival. Military activity might disrupt management of the estate. food shortages could create additional challenges during difficult years. Even indirect effects of the war could prove dangerous. What made these risks particularly alarming was the absence of any safeguard. There was no insurance policy against catastrophe. If disaster struck Chillingham Park, the entire bloodline could vanish. Centuries of unique history, preserved through generation after generation of survival, would disappear forever. As Britain prepared for an uncertain future, more experts began recognizing the seriousness of the problem. The question was no longer whether the cattle were valuable enough to save. Their importance was already widely acknowledged. Instead, the challenge was determining how to protect such a rare and vulnerable population in a world increasingly dominated by war. The realization that one isolated herd carried the entire future of an irreplaceable bloodline would eventually inspire extraordinary measures. Faced with the possibility that centuries of biological heritage could be erased by a single unforeseen event, conservation-minded individuals began searching for solutions that extended far beyond the boundaries of northern England. Those efforts would ultimately lead to one of the most unusual preservation missions undertaken during the Second World War, a mission born from the simple but powerful belief that some things are too valuable to risk losing forever. To modern audiences, the idea of dedicating time, money, and resources to saving a rare breed of cattle during the middle of a global war may seem unusual, even difficult to understand. When nations are fighting for survival, priorities are typically focused on military operations, industrial production, food supplies, and civilian safety. Against such a backdrop, the fate of a small herd of cattle might appear insignificant. Yet for scientists, conservationists, historians, and agricultural experts of the time, the situation looked very different. They understood that the Chillingham cattle represented something far more important than a group of farm animals. The herd embodied centuries of biological history that existed nowhere else on Earth. Their value could not be measured in terms of meat production, milk yields, or commercial profitability. Instead, their importance lay in their uniqueness. For hundreds of years, the Chillingham cattle had remained isolated from other livestock populations, creating a genetic lineage unlike any other. Researchers studying animal breeding and genetics recognized that such long-term isolation was extraordinarily rare. Most livestock breeds had experienced extensive crossbreeding over generations, making it difficult to trace older characteristics or understand how certain traits evolved. The Chillingham herd offered a rare opportunity to examine a population that had remained largely separate from these influences. Scientists hoped that studying the cattle might provide valuable clues about the development of European livestock and the processes that shaped domestic animal populations over centuries. In an era when the science of genetics was rapidly advancing, such opportunities were considered immensely valuable. The cattle represented a living archive of biological information, one that could not be recreated if lost. Their continued existence, therefore, carried significance far beyond the boundaries of a single English estate. To those who understood their importance, preserving the herd was not a matter of sentiment or nostalgia. It was a matter of protecting an irreplaceable scientific resource that future generations might study and learn from. The more experts examined the herd, the more convinced they became that its survival mattered not only to Britain, but to the broader understanding of animal history and evolution. This growing appreciation transformed the cattle from a local curiosity into an internationally recognized treasure whose loss would represent a serious setback for science, conservation, and historical research alike.
The significance of the Chillingham cattle extended beyond genetics alone. Researchers were equally fascinated by the animals' behavior and their unusual way of life.
Unlike ordinary livestock raised under close human supervision, the Chillingham herd existed in a semi-wild state that had persisted for generations. They organized themselves into social groups, established hierarchies, defended territory, and interacted with one another in ways that resembled wild animal populations more than modern farm herds. These characteristics made them particularly valuable to scientists interested in understanding animal behavior and population dynamics. The cattle provided a rare opportunity to observe how a long isolated herd functioned when largely left to its own devices. Such observations offered insights that could not easily be obtained elsewhere. Historians and naturalists were equally captivated. Some viewed the herd as a living connection to Britain's distant past, preserving elements of a landscape and agricultural world that had largely disappeared. Over the centuries, modernization had transformed farming across Europe. Traditional breeds had often been replaced by animals selected for greater productivity and efficiency. As industrial agriculture expanded, commercial considerations increasingly determined which breeds survived and which vanished. Countless ancient livestock populations disappeared during this process, either absorbed into larger breeding programs or abandoned entirely. Heritage breeds that lacked clear economic advantages frequently declined in numbers and, in some cases, disappeared altogether. Against this backdrop, the survival of the Chillingham cattle appeared almost miraculous. Their continued existence owed much to generations of landowners who recognized their uniqueness and protected them despite the changing demands of agriculture. Without this long-term commitment, the herd would likely have vanished long before the 20th century. Conservation-minded observers viewed the cattle as evidence that valuable biological heritage could survive when people made a conscious effort to preserve it. Yet even as appreciation for the herd grew, so too did awareness of its vulnerability. The same factors that made the cattle unique also made them fragile. Their small population size, geographic isolation, and dependence on a single location created risks that became increasingly difficult to ignore. The outbreak of war magnified those concerns dramatically. A herd that had survived centuries of social, economic, and agricultural change now faced dangers unlike any it had encountered before. Modern warfare introduced threats that could not be predicted or controlled. Bombing campaigns, military occupation, resource shortages, and widespread disruption all had the potential to place the cattle at risk. For those responsible for protecting the herd, it became clear that traditional methods of preservation might no longer be sufficient in a world transformed by conflict. As the Second World War intensified, supporters of the Chillingham cattle found themselves confronting an increasingly difficult question. Was it enough to continue protecting the herd within the relative safety of Chillingham Park, or did the circumstances demand a more dramatic solution? Under normal conditions, relocating members of such a unique population would have seemed unnecessary and perhaps even undesirable. The cattle had survived in their historic environment for centuries, and their connection to that landscape formed an important part of their identity. Yet wartime conditions forced conservationists to think in new ways. The possibility that a single, unforeseen event could eliminate the entire bloodline became harder to dismiss. If invasion occurred, if bombing campaigns expanded, or if wartime shortages disrupted the management of the estate, the consequences could be devastating. Because every member of the population lived in the same location, the future of the breed depended upon the survival of one herd. Increasingly, experts began considering whether a second population should be established elsewhere as a form of insurance against catastrophe. The idea was bold and controversial. Transporting valuable cattle across the Atlantic Ocean during wartime presented enormous challenges. The journey itself would be dangerous. German submarines prowled shipping lanes, merchant vessels faced constant threats, and wartime transportation resources were already stretched thin. Livestock would require food, water, veterinary care, and careful supervision throughout the voyage. The financial costs would be considerable, and there was no guarantee that the effort would succeed. Furthermore, some questioned whether removing animals from their historic home was appropriate at all. Nevertheless, the argument in favor of relocation grew stronger as the war continued. The risks associated with transportation, however significant, had to be weighed against the possibility of complete extinction. For many supporters of the herd, that comparison ultimately became decisive. A difficult and dangerous rescue mission was preferable to losing centuries of biological history forever. The discussion reflected a broader shift in conservation thinking. Rather than relying solely on protection within a single location, experts increasingly recognized the value of creating backup populations to guard against disaster. Today, such strategies are common in wildlife conservation and species recovery programs, but during the early 1940s, the concept remained relatively innovative. In the case of the Chillingham cattle, wartime necessity accelerated the search for solutions. What had once seemed like a radical proposal gradually began to appear both practical and essential. The survival of one of Britain's most remarkable animal populations might ultimately depend upon taking extraordinary action. As supporters weighed the dangers of relocation against the dangers of inaction, a consensus slowly emerged. The future of the herd could no longer be left entirely to chance. If these unique cattle were to survive whatever the war might bring, they would need more than protection. They would need a safeguard beyond Britain's shores, a second chance preserved far from the uncertainties engulfing Europe. During the Second World War, few places on Earth were as dangerous as the Atlantic Ocean. Stretching thousands of miles between North America and Europe, the Atlantic served as a vital lifeline connecting Britain to its allies and to the resources needed for survival. Every day, merchant ships crossed its vast waters, carrying food, fuel, weapons, raw materials, and countless other supplies essential to the war effort. Without these shipments, Britain would struggle to continue fighting. Yet every voyage carried enormous risks. Hidden beneath the waves, German U-boats hunted Allied shipping with relentless determination. These submarines formed the backbone of Germany's effort to cut Britain off from the outside world. Operating alone or in coordinated groups known as wolf packs, they stalked shipping routes that stretched across the ocean. Merchant crews often lived with the constant fear that a torpedo could strike without warning. Many vessels disappeared beneath the waves in a matter of minutes, taking cargo and crew with them. Survivors who escaped sinking ships frequently faced freezing water, rough seas, and long waits for rescue. The Battle of the Atlantic became one of the longest and most critical campaigns of the war, a struggle fought across enormous distances where victory depended upon maintaining supply lines despite constant danger. Convoys of merchant vessels traveled together under naval escort in an effort to improve their chances of survival. Warships scanned the horizon for threats while aircraft patrolled whenever possible, but protection was never guaranteed.
Storms, darkness, and the vastness of the ocean often favored the hunters.
Every successful crossing represented a triumph over both nature and enemy action. Against this backdrop, the idea of transporting rare cattle across the Atlantic seemed remarkably ambitious. The journey would expose the animals to many of the same dangers faced by soldiers, sailors, and merchant crews. Yet supporters of the Chillingham cattle increasingly believed that such risks might be necessary. The herd's future could not be guaranteed if it remained entirely dependent on one location in wartime Britain. As conservationists considered their options, they faced a difficult reality. Any attempt to establish a safeguard population overseas would require moving animals through one of the most dangerous environments in the world. The Atlantic offered no easy passage. Every mile carried uncertainty, and every day at sea introduced new risks. Nevertheless, those determined to preserve the cattle concluded that the dangers of transport had to be weighed against the dangers of extinction. If the bloodline was to survive regardless of what happened in Europe, a journey across the ocean might be the only viable solution. What followed would become one of the most unusual conservation efforts undertaken during the war, driven by the belief that some pieces of history were worth protecting even under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Transporting livestock across the Atlantic during wartime presented challenges far beyond those associated with ordinary cargo. Unlike crates of equipment or shipments of raw materials, living animals required constant care throughout the voyage. Every aspect of their well-being had to be considered long before a ship left port. Adequate food supplies needed to be loaded and carefully stored to ensure the animals could be fed for the duration of the crossing. Fresh water had to be available in sufficient quantities, not only for the crew, but also for the livestock whose survival depended upon regular access to clean drinking water. Space was another important concern. Animals could not simply be packed into confined areas without regard for comfort and safety. They required room to stand, move, and rest during what could be a lengthy and unpredictable journey. Veterinary care also had to be arranged in case illness or injury occurred while at sea. Even under normal conditions, transporting livestock over long distances carried risks. During wartime, those risks multiplied. Storms could batter ships for days, creating difficult conditions for both crew and animals. Rough seas might cause injuries or stress among livestock unaccustomed to constant motion. Disease posed another danger, particularly when animals were confined for extended periods. Careful planning was necessary to reduce these threats and maximize the chances of a successful voyage. Above all, however, there remained the danger that overshadowed every Atlantic crossing during the war: enemy attack. A single torpedo strike could destroy not only the ship, but also the rare animals it carried. For those involved in planning the relocation of the Chillingham cattle, these realities could not be ignored. Yet, despite the obstacles, preparations continued. The goal was clear. A small group of cattle would be transported abroad to establish a safeguard population beyond the reach of the war. If disaster struck Britain, the bloodline would not disappear completely. Somewhere else, descendants of the herd would survive. This concept reflected a forward-thinking approach to conservation, one based on reducing risk through geographic separation. Rather than placing the future of the breed entirely in one location, supporters hoped to create a second population, capable of preserving the lineage under different circumstances. Such thinking is common in modern conservation efforts, but at the time it represented a bold and innovative response to an unprecedented threat. The decision required courage, resources, and a willingness to undertake significant risks in pursuit of long-term survival. As plans advanced, attention turned toward identifying the best possible destination for the cattle, a place where they could be protected, cared for, and given the opportunity to thrive far from the dangers consuming Europe. The destination ultimately chosen for the safeguard population was the United States, and more specifically, the state of Texas. At first glance, the selection may seem surprising. When people think of rare British cattle, the landscapes of northern England and the vast ranch lands of Texas appear to have little in common. Yet the choice reflected careful consideration of practical realities. Texas possessed several advantages that made it an attractive refuge. The state had a long and respected tradition of cattle ranching, supported by generations of experience in livestock management. Ranchers and agricultural specialists possess the knowledge necessary to care for valuable animals and maintain healthy breeding populations. The region also offered abundant land, allowing livestock to be managed in conditions suitable for long-term preservation. Equally important, Texas lay thousands of miles from the battlefields of Europe. While war affected the entire world, the physical dangers threatening Britain were far less immediate in the American Southwest. There, the cattle could potentially survive regardless of how events unfolded across the Atlantic. Once the destination had been identified, attention shifted toward the practical challenge of preparing the animals for transport. This task proved particularly complex because the Chillingham cattle were not ordinary livestock. Their semi-wild nature distinguished them from animals accustomed to frequent human handling. For centuries, they had lived with relatively little direct interference, maintaining behaviors and instincts that often surprised observers. Moving such animals required exceptional care. Handlers needed to minimize stress while ensuring the cattle could be safely loaded, transported, and monitored throughout the journey. Every stage of the operation demanded careful planning. From gathering the selected animals to arranging their accommodation aboard ship, no detail could be overlooked. The success of the mission depended upon balancing the welfare of the cattle with the realities of wartime transportation. Eventually, the preparations were completed. The selected animals were loaded aboard a vessel and began an extraordinary voyage unlike anything their ancestors had experienced. Behind them lay the familiar landscapes of Britain, where generations of the herd had lived and died within the boundaries of Chillingham Park. Ahead stretched thousands of miles of open ocean and an uncertain future in a distant land. The crossing would test both the resilience of the animals and the determination of those committed to preserving them. Every day at sea brought them farther from home, but closer to safety. Somewhere beyond the horizon awaited Texas, a place chosen not because it resembled their historic homeland, but because it offered something even more important during a time of global war. The possibility that the bloodline would endure no matter what fate befell the world they had left behind. When the cattle finally reached America after their long and hazardous journey across the Atlantic, they entered a world that differed dramatically from the one their ancestors had known for centuries. For generations, the Chillingham cattle had lived within the enclosed landscapes of northern England, surrounded by rolling countryside, cool temperatures, and a climate shaped by frequent rain and relatively mild seasonal changes. Their new surroundings could hardly have been more different. Texas was a land of vast distances, expansive horizons, and a scale that often surprised visitors from Europe. The terrain stretched outward for miles, offering open spaces that contrasted sharply with the smaller fields and historic estates of Britain. The climate was warmer, drier in many regions, and shaped by environmental conditions unlike those found at Chillingham Park. Even the culture surrounding livestock was different. In Britain, cattle raising often occurred on comparatively modest farms and estates, while Texas possessed a long tradition of ranching on a scale that had become legendary. Large ranches managed substantial herds across extensive areas, supported by generations of expertise in livestock care and breeding. For the Chillingham cattle, the transition represented more than a change of location. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in their history, one that would unfold thousands of miles from the landscape that had shaped them for centuries. Yet, despite these dramatic differences, the purpose of their relocation remained remarkably simple. The objective was not to transform the cattle, improve them, or integrate them into commercial ranching operations. The goal was survival. Every decision surrounding the move had been guided by a single principle: ensure that the bloodline endured regardless of what happened in Europe. The Texas herd was never intended to replace the original population in Britain. Instead, it served as a safeguard, a living insurance policy created to protect centuries of biological history from the uncertainties of war. If catastrophe struck the original herd, descendants preserved in America could ensure that the lineage would not disappear entirely. The concept may seem straightforward today, but at the time it represented a remarkably innovative approach to conservation. Rather than relying on a single vulnerable population, supporters sought to distribute risk by creating a second population in a distant and secure location. In doing so, they embraced a principle that would later become fundamental to modern conservation efforts around the world. Long before such practices became common, the relocation of the Chillingham cattle demonstrated the value of thinking beyond immediate circumstances and planning for the long-term survival of unique biological resources. Today, the idea of maintaining multiple populations of a rare species or breed is widely accepted within conservation science. Zoos coordinate breeding programs for endangered animals. Wildlife agencies establish populations in different regions to reduce vulnerability. Conservation organizations carefully monitor genetic diversity to ensure long-term health and resilience. Seed banks preserve plant varieties against future threats, while researchers maintain genetic records and breeding strategies designed to prevent extinction. These approaches are now considered standard tools in the effort to protect biodiversity. During the years of the Second World War, however, such concepts were still evolving. Conservation biology as a formal scientific discipline had not yet fully developed, and many of the strategies commonly used today were only beginning to emerge. In this context, the decision to establish a safeguard population of Chillingham cattle overseas appears strikingly forward-thinking. The individuals who supported the relocation recognized a problem that modern conservationists would later describe in precise scientific terms. A population confined to a single location faces inherent risks. No matter how well protected that location may be, disease, environmental disasters, human conflict, or unforeseen events can threaten its survival. Creating a second population in another location dramatically reduces the likelihood that a single catastrophe will wipe out an entire bloodline. This principle seems obvious in hindsight, yet applying it during wartime required both imagination and determination. The relocation of the cattle reflected a willingness to think beyond traditional approaches to preservation. Rather than assuming that historical continuity alone would guarantee survival, supporters acknowledged that changing circumstances demanded new solutions. Their efforts demonstrated a growing awareness that rare breeds represented valuable resources worthy of active protection. This perspective was particularly significant because the cattle offered little economic incentive compared to many commercial livestock breeds. They were not transported because they generated exceptional profits or served an essential role in food production. The resources devoted to their preservation were justified for different reasons. Scientists valued their unique genetics. Historians appreciated their connection to the past. Conservationists recognized their rarity. Together, these factors created a compelling case for action. The relocation, therefore, represented more than a practical response to wartime danger. It reflected a broader shift in thinking about what deserved protection. Increasingly, people were beginning to understand that biological heritage possessed value independent of immediate economic usefulness. Preserving a rare breed could be worthwhile simply because it represented a unique and irreplaceable part of human and natural history. In many ways, the rescue of the Chillingham cattle anticipated ideas that would later become central to conservation efforts around the world, making it an important milestone in the evolving relationship between society and the preservation of biodiversity. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the rescue effort was the motivation behind it. Throughout history, livestock had typically been valued according to their practical contributions. Animals were bred and maintained because they provided food, labor, transportation, or economic benefits. Decisions about breeding and management were usually guided by considerations of productivity and efficiency. By the 20th century, these priorities had become even more pronounced as modern agriculture increasingly emphasized commercial performance. Breeds that produced more milk, grew more quickly, or adapted well to industrial farming systems often prospered, while less productive breeds frequently declined. Against this backdrop, the decision to preserve the Chillingham cattle was unusual. Their significance could not be measured primarily in economic terms. They were not being protected because they generated exceptional profits. They were not being relocated because military planners considered them strategically important. Instead, they were saved because people believed they possessed historical, cultural, and biological value. That distinction mattered enormously. It revealed a growing recognition that heritage breeds represented something more than agricultural assets. They were living repositories of history, carrying within them genetic characteristics and evolutionary stories that had developed over centuries. Losing such a population would mean losing knowledge and diversity that could never be recreated. The rescue effort therefore reflected a broader understanding of conservation as an act of stewardship. It acknowledged that preserving the past sometimes requires deliberate intervention, especially during periods of crisis. The fact that these efforts occurred during the largest war in human history makes them even more remarkable. Governments and citizens were focused on survival, military operations, and national defense. Resources were scarce, transportation was dangerous, and uncertainty affected nearly every aspect of daily life. Yet even amid these extraordinary challenges, individuals remained committed to protecting a rare herd of cattle because they understood its long-term significance. Their actions demonstrated that conservation is not merely a concern for times of peace and prosperity. It can also be a priority during moments of profound uncertainty, when the future itself appears at risk. The relocation of the Chillingham cattle stands as an example of this principle. It showed that, even during humanity's greatest conflict, people recognized the importance of preserving unique pieces of biological and cultural heritage. The Texas herd became more than a backup population. It became a symbol of foresight, resilience, and the belief that some things are worth protecting regardless of circumstance. By ensuring the survival of a rare and irreplaceable bloodline, those involved in the rescue left a legacy that extended far beyond the war itself, helping to shape ideas about conservation that continue to influence preservation efforts to this day. While the Chillingham cattle gradually adapted to their new surroundings in Texas, the war that had inspired their relocation continued to expand across the globe. The decision to create a safeguard population had been driven by fears about what might happen if Britain faced catastrophe, and in the years that followed, events repeatedly demonstrated that those fears were far from unreasonable. The conflict grew into a truly global struggle, reaching across continents, oceans, and societies on a scale never before witnessed in human history. During the summer and autumn of 1940, Britain faced one of its greatest tests in the Battle of Britain.
German aircraft launched sustained attacks against military targets, airfields, and industrial centers in an effort to gain control of the skies.
Day after day, pilots fought desperate battles above the English countryside, while civilians watched the conflict unfold overhead. The outcome carried enormous significance. Had Germany succeeded in achieving air superiority, the possibility of invasion would have increased dramatically. Although Britain ultimately resisted the assault, the threat underscored how vulnerable the nation remained. The danger became even more apparent during the Blitz, a prolonged bombing campaign that targeted British cities. Night after night, air raid sirens sounded as waves of bombers crossed the country. Explosions shattered neighborhoods, fires illuminated the darkness, and entire districts were transformed into landscapes of rubble and destruction. London suffered repeated attacks, but many other cities experienced similar devastation. Homes, businesses, transportation networks, and historic landmarks were damaged or destroyed. Civilians endured years of uncertainty, never knowing whether the next raid might strike their community. These experiences reinforced a harsh reality. Even places far removed from the front lines could be profoundly affected by modern warfare. For those concerned about preserving rare and irreplaceable resources, including unique animal populations, such events served as powerful reminders of how quickly circumstances could change. The war demonstrated again and again that no one could confidently predict which areas would remain safe or what challenges the future might bring. Against this backdrop, the decision to establish a second population of Chillingham cattle overseas appeared increasingly prudent. Every bomb that fell on Britain, every military crisis, and every new threat highlighted the wisdom of ensuring that the herd's future no longer depended entirely upon a single location. The cattle in Texas represented more than a conservation project. They represented a safeguard against uncertainty itself, a recognition that survival often depends upon preparing for possibilities that one hopes will never occur. As the war progressed, the conflict expanded far beyond Britain and Western Europe. New campaigns opened across vast regions of the world, each introducing additional uncertainty about the future. In North Africa, Allied and Axis forces fought a prolonged struggle across deserts stretching thousands of miles. Battles shifted back and forth as armies advanced and retreated through harsh environments that tested both men and equipment. In 1941, Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, opening one of the largest and bloodiest fronts in military history. The scale of the fighting dwarfed anything previously seen in the war. Entire cities were besieged, millions of soldiers were mobilized, and enormous resources were consumed in a conflict that would reshape the course of the war. Later that same year, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into the conflict, transforming what had begun as a European war into an even broader global struggle. Across oceans and continents, new theaters of war emerged, drawing nations and populations into an increasingly interconnected conflict. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic continued without pause. Merchant convoys carrying vital supplies remained vulnerable to submarine attack, and every successful crossing represented a hard-won achievement. These events contributed to a pervasive sense of uncertainty that persisted year after year. No one knew how long the war would last or how it would ultimately end. Predictions frequently proved wrong as unexpected developments altered the strategic situation. Victories were followed by setbacks, and setbacks were followed by new opportunities. For Britain, maintaining resilience required enormous effort. The nation devoted vast resources to sustaining military operations while also supporting civilian life under difficult conditions. Food rationing became a routine part of daily existence. Agricultural production was expanded to reduce dependence on imports threatened by submarine warfare. Land was cultivated more intensively, and farmers faced increasing pressure to maximize output. Resource shortages affected countless aspects of society. Fuel, raw materials, labor, and transportation all became subject to wartime constraints. Under such circumstances, it was entirely reasonable to worry about the fate of vulnerable populations that depended upon careful management and long-term protection. Rare breeds, by their very nature, often lack the large numbers and geographic distribution that provide resilience during crises. Had the war developed differently, the risks facing such populations might have become even more severe. Conservationists understood this reality well. They knew that extinction is often the result of a chain of events rather than a single disaster. War had the potential to disrupt food supplies, alter land use, limit available resources, and create pressures that could affect rare animal populations in unexpected ways. The continued existence of a second herd in Texas therefore carried significance far beyond its immediate practical value. It represented an acknowledgement that preserving a unique bloodline required preparation for a wide range of possible futures, including those that seemed unlikely but could not be ignored. As the years passed and the war continued, the presence of the Texas herd provided a measure of reassurance to those who had supported its creation. The original purpose of the relocation had never been to replace the Chillingham cattle in Britain or to separate them permanently from their historic homeland. Instead, the goal had always been to create a safeguard against catastrophe. In that respect, the mission had already succeeded. The bloodline no longer depended entirely upon a single herd living in a single location. For centuries, the future of the cattle had rested upon the continued stability of one estate in northern England. Any major disaster affecting that location could potentially have ended the lineage forever. Now, however, the situation had changed. Thousands of miles away, another population existed. The cattle in Texas represented continuity, a living backup that preserved the possibility of survival even under the worst imaginable circumstances. This achievement reflected an important principle that would later become central to conservation efforts around the world. Effective preservation often requires redundancy. When all members of a rare population occupy the same place, the risk of total loss remains high. By creating additional populations in separate locations, conservationists reduce the likelihood that a single event will eliminate an entire lineage. Although such thinking is now common, it was far less widespread during the early 1940s. The rescue of the Chillingham cattle therefore stands as an early example of a strategy that would later become standard practice. The value of the Texas herd was not measured by what it did on a daily basis, but by what it made possible. It ensured that extinction was no longer the inevitable outcome of a disaster in Britain. Even if tragedy struck the original herd, descendants would survive elsewhere. That simple fact justified the risks and effort involved in the relocation. As the war gradually turned in favor of the Allies, hopes for eventual victory increased, but uncertainty never disappeared completely until the conflict finally ended. Throughout those difficult years, the existence of the safeguard population remained a quiet source of confidence. It served as proof that thoughtful preparation could reduce vulnerability even in the face of extraordinary challenges. The rescue mission had been inspired by fear, but it was ultimately guided by foresight. Those responsible recognized that preserving something unique sometimes requires action before disaster occurs rather than after it is too late. The cattle living in Texas embodied that lesson. Their presence demonstrated that survival is often secured not by luck alone, but by the willingness to anticipate risks and prepare for them. That had been the entire purpose of the mission from the beginning, to ensure that one of Britain's most remarkable and irreplaceable animal lineages would have a future, regardless of what uncertainties the war might bring. By the later years of the Second World War, the balance of the conflict had begun to shift. The dark period during which Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable was gradually giving way to a new reality. Across multiple fronts, Allied forces were gaining momentum, and the possibility of ultimate victory appeared increasingly achievable. Yet this transformation did not occur overnight. Years of sacrifice, hardship, and uncertainty lay behind it. Throughout the early stages of the war, Britain and its allies had faced repeated crises that threatened not only military success, but national survival itself. By contrast, the developments of 1944 offered a growing sense of optimism. Allied armies had established themselves firmly on the offensive. In June of that year, the D-Day landings in Normandy marked the beginning of one of the most significant military operations in history. Thousands of ships, aircraft, and soldiers crossed the English Channel to open a new front in Western Europe. From that point onward, Allied forces steadily advanced against German positions. Cities and towns that had endured years of occupation were gradually liberated. Across Europe, people who had lived under the shadow of war began to glimpse the possibility of freedom. For Britain, these advances represented more than military achievements. They suggested that the long period of uncertainty which had inspired extraordinary protective measures, including the relocation of the Chillingham cattle, might eventually come to an end. Yet, even as Allied victories accumulated, no one could be entirely certain how events would unfold. The war had repeatedly demonstrated its capacity for unexpected developments. New offensives, fierce resistance, and ongoing battles continued to claim lives and consume resources. While hope was growing, caution remained necessary. Those responsible for safeguarding valuable resources understood that the dangers which had motivated their decisions had not disappeared overnight. The existence of the Texas herd therefore continued to provide reassurance. Its purpose had never depended upon predicting exactly what would happen. Instead, it existed to protect against uncertainty itself. As Allied armies moved deeper into Europe, the wisdom of that approach became increasingly evident. The cattle preserved overseas represented a guarantee that no matter how the final stages of the war unfolded, one of Britain's most unique animal lineages would have a future. In this sense, the safeguard population remained just as important during the war's closing years as it had been during its darkest moments. The fact that disaster seemed less likely did not diminish the value of protection. Rather, it highlighted the foresight of those who had acted before circumstances improved. In 1945, the conflict in Europe finally reached its conclusion. After years of devastating warfare, relentless bombing campaigns, enormous military operations, and unimaginable human suffering, Nazi Germany surrendered. The war that had transformed the continent and reshaped the lives of millions came to an end. Across Britain, celebrations erupted as news of victory spread. Crowds gathered in cities and towns, flags appeared in windows, and people marked the end of a struggle that had dominated nearly every aspect of daily life for almost 6 years. Yet beneath the celebrations lay a more complicated reality. Britain had emerged victorious, but it had also emerged exhausted. The nation had endured immense sacrifices. Entire neighborhoods had been damaged or destroyed by bombing. Families had lost loved ones serving in the armed forces or working in dangerous wartime occupations. Economic resources had been stretched to their limits, and recovery would require years of effort. As peace returned, people across the country began assessing what had survived and what had been lost. Historic buildings, cultural treasures, industries, communities, and landscapes all bore the marks of war. In many cases, losses were permanent. Some structures would never be rebuilt exactly as they had been. Some communities would never fully recover from the human cost of the conflict. Against this backdrop, the survival of the Chillingham cattle appeared all the more remarkable. Despite the fears that had existed during the early years of the war, the original herd had remained intact. The disaster that conservationists had worried about had never occurred. Chillingham Park had survived the conflict, and the cattle continued to graze the same landscape their ancestors had occupied for centuries. To some observers, this outcome might have suggested that the effort to establish a safeguard population overseas had been unnecessary. After all, the original herd had endured. Yet, such a conclusion misunderstands the purpose of the rescue mission. The relocation was never based on certainty that disaster would occur. It was based on recognition that disaster could occur. The goal was not to predict the future accurately, but to ensure survival regardless of what the future held. In this respect, the continued existence of both the original herd and the Texas population represented a success rather than a redundancy. The preservation effort had achieved exactly what it was designed to accomplish. The cattle had survived, and the possibility of extinction had been dramatically reduced throughout the years when danger seemed greatest. Looking back after the war, many recognized that the value of the safeguard herd could not be measured solely by whether it was ultimately needed. Its true value lay in the security it provided during a period when outcomes remained uncertain and the consequences of inaction could have been irreversible. The story of the Chillingham cattle during the Second World War offers an important lesson about the nature of successful preservation efforts.
In popular memory, success is often associated with traumatic rescues that occur after disaster strikes. We tend to celebrate moments when heroic action saves something that is already in immediate danger. Yet many of the most effective acts of conservation work in a different way. Their success lies not in responding to catastrophe, but in preventing catastrophe from becoming possible in the first place. The relocation of part of the Chillingham bloodline to Texas illustrates this principle perfectly. The feared destruction of the original herd never occurred. The cattle in Britain survived the war, and the backup population was never called upon to restore a lost lineage. On the surface, this outcome might make the rescue appear unnecessary. In reality, it demonstrates precisely why the effort was worthwhile. During the years when invasions seemed possible, when bombs fell on British cities, when resources were scarce, and when the future remained uncertain, the existence of a second population provided protection against the worst imaginable outcome. Extinction was no longer a single event away. The bloodline no longer depended entirely upon one location. If circumstances had unfolded differently, descendants preserved overseas could have ensured the continuation of a unique lineage stretching back centuries. That possibility alone justified the effort. Modern conservation programs operate according to the same principle. Wildlife populations are often established in multiple locations. Seed banks preserve genetic material against future threats. Rare breeds are maintained through carefully managed breeding programs. The goal is not merely to respond to disasters after they happen, but to create conditions in which disasters cannot erase something forever. Long before such approaches became common, the rescue of the Chillingham cattle demonstrated the effectiveness of this way of thinking. The mission succeeded because it achieved its intended objective. It reduced risk. It preserved options. It ensured continuity during a period of extraordinary uncertainty. Sometimes the greatest success of a rescue effort is invisible. It is measured not by what happened, but by what did not happen. The Chillingham cattle were never driven to extinction. Their unique genetic heritage was never lost. Their centuries-long story was never brought to an abrupt end by the chaos of war. The existence of the Texas herd helped make that outcome possible. In the end, the rescue mission stands as a reminder that foresight can be just as important as action, and that protecting the future often means preparing for dangers that one hopes will never arrive. The tragedy that conservationists feared never occurred, and that, perhaps, was the greatest success of all. The story of the Chillingham cattle extends far beyond the events of the Second World War. At first glance, it may appear to be a unique episode tied to a specific historical moment, a wartime effort to protect a rare herd from the uncertainties of global conflict. Yet the principles that guided the rescue have proven remarkably enduring. In many ways, the decisions made by those seeking to preserve the cattle anticipated ideas that would later become central to modern conservation. Today, conservationists around the world face challenges that differ in many respects from those of the 1940s, yet they often rely upon the same fundamental logic. Whether protecting endangered animals, preserving rare plant species, or safeguarding genetic diversity, the goal remains similar. Reduce vulnerability by ensuring that no irreplaceable resource depends entirely upon a single location or a single population. Modern conservation efforts frequently involve establishing backup populations in multiple regions.
Endangered species may be reintroduced into areas beyond their original habitats to reduce the risk that disease, natural disasters, or human activities will eliminate them entirely. Zoos and wildlife parks cooperate internationally to maintain breeding populations that serve as insurance against extinction in the wild.
Botanical gardens cultivate rare plants far from their native environments, creating additional layers of protection.
In each case, the underlying principle is the same one that motivated the relocation of the Chillingham cattle. Survival becomes more likely when risk is distributed rather than concentrated. History has repeatedly shown that populations confined to one place are vulnerable to sudden and unpredictable events. A disease outbreak, environmental catastrophe, political upheaval, or armed conflict can quickly threaten a species or breed if all members occupy the same location. By creating additional populations elsewhere, conservationists improve the chances that at least some individuals will survive, even if disaster strikes. The people who organized the wartime safeguard population for the Chillingham cattle may not have used the terminology of modern conservation biology, but they understood this principle intuitively. They recognized that a unique bloodline deserved protection beyond the boundaries of a single estate. Their actions reflected a sophisticated understanding of risk management long before such approaches became widely institutionalized. Looking back, it is clear that the rescue mission represented more than an isolated wartime decision. It foreshadowed strategies that would later become standard practice in efforts to preserve biodiversity around the world, demonstrating how foresight and preparation can help protect irreplaceable elements of the natural world. One of the most striking aspects of modern conservation is the emphasis placed on preserving genetic diversity. Scientists now understand that the survival of species and breeds depends not only on the number of individuals that exist, but also on the genetic variation they contain. Genetic diversity provides populations with resilience, helping them adapt to changing environments, resist disease, and maintain long-term health. As a result, contemporary conservation programs often devote significant resources to preserving genetic material for future generations. Seeds from thousands of plant species are stored in secure facilities designed to withstand natural disasters, political instability, and even global crises. Frozen genetic samples are maintained in specialized repositories, allowing researchers and conservationists to preserve valuable biological information even if living populations decline. Rare breeds of livestock are monitored carefully to ensure that unique characteristics are not lost through neglect or excessive crossbreeding. These practices are now regarded as essential components of conservation planning, but the logic behind them can be traced to the same concerns that motivated efforts to protect the Chillingham cattle during the war. The herd represented a unique genetic lineage that had survived centuries of isolation. Scientists recognized that if the cattle disappeared, an irreplaceable body of biological information would vanish with them. The significance of the herd extended beyond its immediate usefulness. Its value lay in its distinctiveness, in the fact that it embodied a history and genetic heritage unlike any other. Modern conservationists would describe this as preserving genetic resources, but even before such terminology became common, supporters of the cattle understood what was at stake. They realized that extinction involves more than the loss of individual animals. It also means the disappearance of evolutionary history, biological diversity, and opportunities for future study. The decision to establish a safeguard population therefore reflected an appreciation for concepts that would later become central to conservation science. By ensuring that the bloodline existed in more than one location, supporters reduced the risk that a single disaster could erase centuries of unique development. This approach anticipated the creation of modern seed banks, captive breeding programs, and genetic preservation initiatives. Although the tools available today are far more sophisticated, the underlying objective remains unchanged. Conservation is fundamentally about maintaining options for the future. It seeks to ensure that valuable biological resources survive long enough to be appreciated, studied, and protected by future generations. The wartime relocation of the Chillingham cattle stands as an early example of this philosophy in action, illustrating how concern for long-term preservation can inspire practical measures even under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Chillingham cattle story is the importance of human determination.
Conservation successes are often attributed to scientific knowledge, government policies, or institutional programs, and these factors certainly play important roles.
Yet behind many preservation efforts stand individuals who recognize a threat and decide that action is necessary. The rescue of the Chillingham cattle was not inevitable. It occurred because a group of people understood the herd's significance and refused to accept the possibility of losing it. They recognized that waiting for certainty could be dangerous. By the time a threat becomes obvious, it may already be too late to respond effectively. Instead, they chose to act while there was still time to reduce the risks facing the herd. This willingness to plan ahead proved crucial. The dangers confronting Britain during the Second World War were immense and often unpredictable. No one could know with confidence whether invasion would occur, how long the war would last, or what regions might ultimately be affected. Nevertheless, supporters of the cattle concluded that preparation was preferable to hope alone. Their efforts demonstrated a simple but powerful truth. Unique genetic lineages are often far more fragile than they appear. The Chillingham cattle had survived for centuries, enduring political upheaval, economic change, agricultural transformation, and countless other challenges. Yet their continued existence depended upon a surprisingly narrow foundation. A single, isolated herd represented the entire future of the bloodline. Recognizing this vulnerability required both insight and imagination. Addressing it required commitment. The establishment of a safeguard population in Texas showed what determined individuals could accomplish when they combined concern for the future with practical action. Their success serves as an inspiration for modern conservation efforts. Around the world, people continue working to protect endangered species, preserve rare breeds, and maintain biodiversity in the face of growing challenges. Climate change, habitat loss, pollution, invasive species, and other threats create risks that sometimes appear overwhelming. Yet the story of the Chillingham cattle reminds us that meaningful protection often begins with a simple decision, recognizing that something valuable deserves preservation and taking steps to ensure its survival. Even during a global war, when nations were fighting for their existence and resources were stretched to their limits, people found a way to protect a rare and irreplaceable piece of biological heritage. Their actions demonstrated that conservation is not merely a luxury reserved for peaceful times. It is a responsibility that can endure even amid uncertainty, conflict, and crisis. The survival of the Chillingham cattle stands as lasting proof that foresight, commitment, and determination can preserve history for generations yet to come.
World War II is usually remembered through stories of great battles, famous generals, and powerful political leaders whose decisions shaped the fate of nations.
Yet history is also shaped by quieter acts of preservation that rarely make headlines but carry lasting significance. The rescue of Britain's rare Chillingham cattle reminds us that people fought not only for territory, victory, and survival, but also to protect heritage, knowledge, culture, and living connections to the past. These remarkable white cattle represented centuries of biological and historical legacy, making their survival a matter of far greater importance than simple agriculture.
As war engulfed Europe and uncertainty spread across Britain, a small group of cattle was sent across the dangerous Atlantic Ocean because dedicated individuals believed some things were worth saving regardless of the risks or cost.
The world they left behind faced bombing, invasion fears, and constant danger, while the Texas they entered offered safety and refuge far from the battlefields. Because of that decision, one of Britain's most extraordinary animal lineages gained an additional chance at survival. It was an unusual wartime mission, a little-known rescue operation, and one of the most fascinating examples of conservation during humanity's darkest hour. The sacred cattle survived not by chance alone, but because someone looked into an uncertain future and chose to protect them before it was too late.